Seeing the gray hair, the trembling hands, and the cane, Officer Stan Miller assumed he had found a victim, not an adversary. He laughed as he placed the handcuffs on her arthritic wrists, mocking the pleas for dignity of a 74-year-old woman, but he completely misread the situation. That trembling wasn't fear. It was fury. And the contact named Davy she dialed on her shattered phone screen wasn't a concerned neighbor or a public defender. It was Major David Robinson, a Level 1 Delta Force operator currently on leave, and he was less than 10 minutes away. What happened next wasn't just a rescue. It was a systematic dismantling of corruption that would bring the entire city to its knees. This is the story of how an arrogant police officer messed with the wrong mother. The hydrangeas were thirsty. That was all Hattie Mae Robinson was thinking about as she stepped off her porch, the wooden steps creaking familiarly under her weight. At 74, Hattie moved with a deliberate rhythmic slowness, her movements dictated by the weather in her joints. Today the humidity in the North Carolina air was thick, promising a storm later in the afternoon, but for now the morning sun was golden and deceptive. She adjusted her straw hat, the one with the frayed blue ribbon she'd worn since her husband Silas died in 2008. The Oak Creek neighborhood had changed since then. The small, modest brick bungalows that used to house factory workers and school teachers were slowly being bought up, demolished, and replaced by imposing modern boxes of glass and gray siding. Faces were changing too. There were fewer people sitting on porches these days, fewer greetings from across the street, but Hattie remained. She was a fixture, as deeply rooted as the ancient oak tree that shaded her driveway. Hattie reached for the garden hose, her knuckles swollen and gnarled. She hummed a low gospel tune, "Precious Lord, take my hand," as the water squirted and then flowed clear. She was watering the roots, careful not to wet the leaves, just as her father had taught her 60 years ago. The silence of the street was broken by the low, guttural growl of an engine. Hattie didn't look up right away. Cars drove too fast on Elm Street all the time, but the growl slowed, becoming the distinctive purr of a police cruiser. The tires crunched on gravel as the vehicle partially stopped in her driveway, blocking the way to the mailbox. Hattie straightened up, drying her hands on her floral apron. She squinted against the sun. It was a black and white SUV, the Metro Police Department emblem emblazoned on the side. 2 doors opened. Officer Stan Miller emerged from the driver's side. He was a man who carried his weight in his chest and shoulders, a physique that had once been muscular but was now softening into a heavy, aggressive physique. His sunglasses were perched on the back of his shaved head, and his thumbs were already hooked into his tactical vest. He looked bored, searching for a reason not to be. A younger man, Officer Kyle Jenkins, stepped out of the passenger side. He looked like he'd barely left the academy, his uniform crisp and ill-fitting, his eyes darting nervously toward the houses across the street. "Good morning, Hattie," he called, his voice raspy but polite. She believed in good manners even when others didn't. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Miller didn't answer right away. He walked halfway down the driveway, chewing gum with his mouth open. He stopped near the dahlias, looking her up and down with a gaze that felt like a physical shove. "Do you live here?" Miller asked. "No, ma'am." "No mourning?" Just accusation disguised as a question. Hattie tensed. "I've lived here since 1978, officer. My name is on the deed and on the mailbox." Miller smiled, a quick, humble twitch on his lips. "We've received reports." "Reports?" Hattie frowned, turning off the nozzle of the hose. The silence returned, heavier now. "Reports of what?" "Excessive gardening, loitering," Miller said, taking another step forward. "Suspicious activity, possible reconnaissance of the property." Hattie let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "Reconnaissance of the property, officer? I'm watering my own flowers." "I have the key to the front door in my pocket." "So you say." Miller said, his voice dropping an octave, growing harsher. "But we've had a string of burglaries in this new development, and you fit the description of a suspect seen peering out of windows yesterday." "A suspect?" Hattie's heart began to pound a warning rhythm against her ribs. A 70-year-old woman with a cane and a bad hip is jumping fences and peering out of windows. She can't be serious. "Let me see your ID," Miller demanded, holding out a hand. "I don't carry my purse when I'm watering the hydrangeas," Hattie said, her dignity hardening to steel. "It's inside. If you'd like to wait, I can go get it. Or better yet, you can ask Mrs. Gable next door. She's known me for 30 years. "I won't ask the neighbors, and I won't let her come in to get a gun," Miller snapped. He disengaged the safety on the holster without drawing the weapon, but resting his hand on it. The threat was clear. "Officer Miller?" The younger officer, Jenkins, chimed in from behind. His voice faltered. She seems to live here, man. Look at the pictures on the porch. That's her in the pictures." Miller jerked his head away. "Shut up, Jenkins. I'm teaching you about situational awareness. Suspects lie. They use props. Secure the perimeter." Miller turned to Hattie. The air between them crackled. Hattie Robinson had raised 3 children. She had buried a husband. She had worked for 40 years as a registered nurse in the chaotic trauma ward. She wasn't afraid of blood, and she wasn't afraid of thugs. "Get off my property," Hattie said. Her voice was calm, trembling, not from fear, but from the effort of control. "You don't have a warrant. You don't have cause. You're harassing an elderly woman." Miller's face turned mottled red. He wasn't used to compliance issues with people who looked like Hattie. He entered her personal space, the smell of stale coffee and aggression radiating from him. "You won't identify yourself," Miller barked, "and you're resisting a lawful order. Put your hands behind your back." "What for?" Hattie cried, backing away, her heel catching on the garden hose. "For watering my flowers? For disorderly conduct and non-compliance?" Miller yelled. He lunged. The contact was shocking in its violence. Miller didn't just grab her. He pinned her. His large, calloused hand encircled Hattie's upper arm, squeezing hard enough to instantly bruise the thin, papery skin. "Hey!" Hattie cried, the sound tearing from her throat, raw and terrified. "Let me go! You're hurting me! You're injuring me! Stop resisting!" Miller roared, turning her around with a force that would have been excessive for a linebacker, let alone a grandmother. Hattie's cane fell with a clatter on the concrete driveway, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Without the support, her bad hip gave way. She started to fall, but Miller roughly pulled her up by the arm, dislocating her shoulder with a terrible crack. "Please," Hattie gasped, tears welling in her eyes from the sharp, burning pain shooting up her arm. "My arm! It's dislocated! Please, get down!" Miller ignored her plea, sweeping her legs out from under her. Hattie hit the concrete hard. The impact took her breath away, her cheeks scraping against the rough gravel of the driveway, sand embedded in her skin. The world spun dizzily. Blue sky, green leaves, gray concrete, black boots. "Miller, stop!" Jenkins yelled, running forward. "She's an old woman, for God's sake. Back off, Jenkins," Miller shouted over his shoulder, pressing his knee into Hattie's small back. The weight was crushing. Hattie gasped, struggling to breathe in her compressed lungs. She reached down to her waist. "You saw it." "I didn't see anything," Jenkins argued, panic rising in his voice, but he didn't physically intervene. He stood there, paralyzed by the badge hierarchy, watching a crime unfold in slow motion. Miller grabbed Hattie's wrists. She had arthritis in both hands, her fingers permanently slightly curved. He forced them together behind her back, twisting them at an unnatural angle. "You're breaking them," Hattie moaned, her face pressed to the ground. "Oh God, you're breaking them." Click, click. The handcuffs dug into her wrists. Tight. Too tight. Miller yanked her up by the chain, forcing her to her knees. Hattie let out a scream of pure agony that pierced the quiet Sunday morning. That scream woke the street. Doors flew open. Mrs. Gable, the 80-year-old neighbor, came out in her dressing gown. A young couple from the new modern house across the street came running out. The phones were already up. "What's he doing to her?" Mrs. Gable shouted, crawling as fast as she could toward the entrance. "That's Hattie. She's the church choir director. Leave her alone." "Police matters. Back off," Miller yelled, gesturing to the gathering crowd. He was sweating now, the adrenaline of the assault mingling with the realization that he had an audience. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. It was a bully's instinct. "He attacked an officer," Miller lied, his voice loud enough for the cameras to hear. "He's under arrest." Hattie was kneeling in her own driveway. Dust on her Sunday dress, blood trickling from a scrape on her cheek. She felt humiliated. She felt small. But beneath the pain, the old Robinson steel began to cool and harden. She looked at Jenkins, the rookie. He was pale, trembling. "Son," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Check my pocket." "What?" Jenkins blinked, startled. "My apron pocket," he scraped. "My phone. I have a right. I have a right to make a call." "You can make a call at the station," Miller growled, dragging her toward the patrol car. "No!" Hattie planted her knees, refusing to budge. The neighbors were shouting louder now. "I know my rights. He's holding someone on private property without a warrant. I have a right to notify my family before he takes me anywhere, unless he wants a kidnapping charge added to his lawsuit." It was a bluff, legally speaking, but the word lawsuit and the growing crowd of iPhones recording made Miller hesitate. He knew the image was bad. If he let her make a call, maybe it would de-escalate the crowd forming on the sidewalk. He figured she'd call a weeping daughter or a local public defender who wouldn't answer on a Sunday. "Fine," Miller spat. He reached into his apron, pulled out an old cracked smartphone and unlocked it. She didn't use a passcode. He held it to her ear, mocking her. "Hurry up, Grandma. Tell him to bring bail money." Hattie didn't scroll through her contacts. She didn't need to look up the number. It was on speed dial, number 1. She leaned her head toward the phone. Miller held it as the line rang. "1 ring? 2 rings?" "Mom." The voice on the other end was clear, alert, and instantly concerned. It wasn't a sleepy Sunday voice. It was a voice that was always ready. "Davy," Hattie said, her voice cracking for the first time. "Davy, honey." "Mom, what's wrong? Why do you sound like this?" The change in tone was instantaneous from son to soldier. "I'm home, Davy. There's a cop, an officer." She looked up, reading the badge number through her puffy eyes. "Officer Miller, badge number 492, and Jenkins." "What did they do to you?" The voice on the phone turned icy. Icy. "He hurt me, honey. He knocked me to the ground. My arm. I think my arm's messed up. They've got me handcuffed in the driveway." There was silence on the other end of the line. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a terrifying, heavy silence. The sound of a predator gauging the distance to its prey. "Are you safe now?" David asked. "Are they still touching you?" "He has the phone. He's standing over me." "Okay," David said. His voice was eerily calm. "Mom, listen to me. Don't say another word. Don't resist. I'm 10 minutes away. I was at the gym on 4th. I'm coming." "Davy, don't do anything crazy," she whispered. "I won't," David promised. "I'm going to do everything exactly by the book. Put him on the phone." "What?" "Put the officer on the phone." Hattie looked at Miller. "He wants to talk to you." Miller laughed, a cruel barking sound. He pulled the phone back to his own ear. Yes, who is it? The grandson. Listen, champ, your grandma's going to jail for assaulting me. This is Major David Robinson, United States Army, Delta Force. The voice cut through Miller's bravado like barbed wire. I'm currently on terminal leave, but I retain full active duty status. You're violating the civil rights of a dependent of a level 1 operator. If you move her an inch from there, from that driveway before I arrive, I will consider it an act of kidnapping and will use the force necessary to interdict. Do you understand? Miller blinked. He looked at the phone, then at the old woman. He rolled his eyes. Yeah, right. And I'm the King of England. Tell that to the judge. G.I. Joe. Miller hung up. He threw her onto the grass. Carry her, Miller ordered Jenkins. But, Jenkins said. He's a liar, Miller said, grabbing Hattie by the arm again. Just some kid trying to scare us. Come on. But as they dragged Hattie toward the back seat, a low rumble began to vibrate in the air. It wasn't a police cruiser. It was the roar of a high-performance engine pushing to the limit, getting closer. Fast. Miller stopped, his hand on the car door. He looked down the street. A matte black, lifted and modified Ford F-15 O-Raptor rounded the corner at the end of the block. It didn't slow down. It roared down the residential street with the terrifying speed of a missile. What the hell? Miller muttered. The truck squealed as it stopped right behind the patrol car, blocking it completely. The driver's door opened before the truck had fully settled on its suspension. A boot hit the pavement. Major David Robinson stood up. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall, wearing gym shorts and a tight military green t-shirt that clung to muscles built for war, not for show. He didn't have a gun in his hand. He didn't need one. The way he approached them, poised, focused, his eyes fixed on Miller, was more threatening than any weapon. Miller reached for his holster. Back off, cop. David didn't stop. He didn't run. He walked with a steady, predatory stride. He raised his hands slowly, palms open, showing he was unarmed, but his voice carried the authority of a man who commanded battalions. I see your hand on your weapon, Officer Miller, David said, his voice clearly reaching the neighbors and the security cameras. I'm unarmed. I'm approaching my wounded mother. If you draw that gun, you'll regret it for the rest of your very short career. The war was about to begin. Miller's hand hovered over his Glock. His knuckles were white. In any other situation, against any other civilian, he would have drawn his weapon then and there, but something about the man 5 feet away stopped him. It wasn't just David Robinson's size, it was his stillness. Most people shout when they're angry. They thrash about. They strut. David did none of that. He stood with his feet shoulder-width apart, his hands open and visible at chest level, his breathing rhythmic and controlled. His dark, expressionless eyes dissected Miller like a biology student dissecting a frog. Back off, sir, Miller shouted, his voice cracking slightly. This is a crime scene. It's my mother's driveway, David corrected, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the humid air. And you've assaulted a 74-year-old woman. I'm checking her vitals. If you shoot me, make sure you kill me, officer, because if I survive, you won't like what happens next. David knelt. She turned her back on the armed officer, the ultimate display of disdain. Mom, David whispered, his expression instantly shifting from warrior to son. He touched her cheek with gentle fingers. Look at me. Breathe. Hattie was sobbing softly now, the adrenaline fading, replaced by the stabbing pain in her shoulder and wrists. My arm, Davy. It hurts so much. David's eyes followed to her shoulder. It was bent forward, the joint clearly dislocated. He saw the bruises blooming on her triceps like dark ink in water. He saw the tight handcuffs digging into her arthritic wrists. A vein in David's temple throbbed once. It was the only sign of the volcanic fury boiling inside him. He had spent 12 years hunting terrorists in the mountains of Afghanistan and the deserts of Syria. He had broken down doors to save strangers. And here, in his own hometown, a man with a badge had done this to the woman who taught him to pray. David stood slowly. He turned to face Miller. "Take them out," David said. It wasn't a request. "You're under arrest." "Assault on an officer, resisting arrest," Miller spat. He took a half-step back. "My mother has walked with a cane for 6 years, David said, pointing to the hickory stick lying in the grass. "You're telling me she assaulted you, a 200-pound man in a body armor?" "Sheep." She lunged. Miller lied. The lie tasted bitter in the air. David looked at Jenkins. The rookie stood by the trunk of the patrol car, looking like he was about to throw up. "Officer Jenkins, is that you?" David asked. He didn't shout. He spoke to Jenkins like a disappointed teacher. "I know your father, Bob Jenkins. He owns the hardware store in Maine. Good man. Does he know his son is standing by and watching elderly women being abused?" I didn't do it," Jenkins stammered, sweat trickling down his pale face. "You're witnessing a serious crime," David said, his voice stern. "Deprivation of rights under the color of the law. Title 18, United States Code, Section 242. If you don't remove those handcuffs right now and call paramedics, you're an accomplice. She'll go to federal prison with him." "Don't listen to him," Miller roared. "Emergency call. Officer in danger. Stand up." Jenkins looked at Miller, then at Hattie, weeping on the ground. He looked at David, who stood like a statue in court. The boy in uniform broke. Jenkins stepped forward, searching for his keys. "Stan, I'm taking these off. Her arm's messed up, man. We can't leave her like this." "Touch those handcuffs and I'll file an insubordination report against you," Miller threatened. "Write to me then," Jenkins muttered. He knelt beside Hattie. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm so sorry." As the handcuffs clicked open, Hattie moaned. Her arms went limp. David was there instantly, supporting her weight. "Don't move your shoulder, Mom," David said gently. "We'll get her to the hospital, but not yet. We need everything documented here first." Miller had retreated to his radio. He was shouting codes, calling for immediate assistance, alleging a hostile crowd and an aggressive suspect. He was trying to control the narrative. He was trying to bury the truth under a wave of blue lights. David pulled his own phone from his pocket. He didn't call 911. He didn't call the precinct. He dialed a number with the Washington, D.C. area code. "Robinson," a voice answered on the first ring. It was sharp, clipped. "Colonel," David said, without taking his eyes off Miller. "I need protocol initiated. Code Black, national soil. I have a hostile entity violating the Soldiers and Marines Civil Relief Act and committing police brutality against the immediate family of a Level 1 asset." "Location?" the colonel asked. No question about whether he was sure. The colonel knew David Robinson wasn't lying. "Oak Creek, North Carolina. Officer Stan Miller. I need JAG. I need the FBI's Civil Rights Division, and I need you to call the governor." "Hold on, Sergeant Major. The cavalry is on its way. Don't get involved unless deadly force is used against you." "Understood," David said. "But, Colonel, if you touch her again, I can't promise I won't make it a past tense." "Understood. The estimated time of arrival of local assets is 5 minutes. David hung up. Miller watched David, who was now moving to the side of his vehicle, waiting for backup. A mocking smile crossed Miller's face, believing the locals would come to his rescue. "You think a phone call intimidates me?" Miller snorted. "This town is mine, kid. My brother's the police chief. You just dug your own grave." David grinned. It was a terrifying grin, like a shark's. "Officer Miller," David said softly, "you play checkers, I play chess, and I just captured your queen." The sirens began like a distant whale wail, quickly becoming a deafening cacophony. Within minutes, Elm Street was flooded. 3 more Metropolitan Police patrol cars screeched to a halt, lights flashing and sirens wailing. 6 officers rushed out, hands in their holsters, adrenaline pumping. They saw Miller waving them on. They saw the suspect David standing over the victim. In Miller's mind. "Get down now!" a sergeant yelled, pointing a taser at David's chest. Neighbors screamed. Mrs. Gable was sobbing hysterically in her garden. The crowd had grown to about 20 people, all recording with their phones. David didn't hit the ground. He slowly raised his hands again. "I'm an active duty soldier. I'm unarmed. My mother needs medical attention." "I said, get on the ground," the sergeant shouted, approaching. "Handcuff him," Miller ordered, emboldened by his reinforcements. "He threatened to kill me. He obstructed justice." 2 officers lunged at David. He didn't resist. He let them grab his massive arms. He let them turn him around. He felt the cold steel of the handcuffs for the second time that day, this time on his own wrists. But as they shoved him against the hood of the car, he didn't fight. He just stared down the street. "You're finished," Miller whispered in David's ear as they patted him down. "Assault on an officer, terrorist threats. I'll make sure you rot in a cell, hero." "Look at the time, Miller," David said calmly, his cheek pressed against the hot metal of the patrol car. 10:14 in the morning. "What?" 10:14 in the morning. "That's the time your life ended." As if responding to a signal, the sound of the local sirens was interrupted by a different sound, a deep, muffled rhythm that rattled the windows of the houses. Whoop, 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 whoop. A black helicopter with no markings except for a tail number circled low over the neighborhood. The wind from its rotors shook the trees, sending leaves swirling. It hovered ominously low over the street. Then the cars arrived. They weren't police cars. They were black Chevrolet Suburbans with tinted windows and government license plates. 4 of them turned the corner, ignoring the police barricade, mounting the sidewalk to avoid the parked patrol cars. They screeched to a halt in close formation. The doors opened. Men in dark suits and headsets poured out. They moved differently than police officers. They moved with the efficient, fluid lethality of federal agents. On the back of their jackets, in thick yellow letters, it said FBI. Behind them, getting out of the first SUV, was a man in an immaculate gray suit. He was older, with silver hair and a face like granite. He carried a leather briefcase. It was Richard Sterling, one of the state's most feared civil rights lawyers, a man who devoured police unions for breakfast, and behind him, stepping out of a rearguard vehicle, was a man in full Army OCP camouflage, bearing the rank of lieutenant colonel. The local deputies froze. The sergeant lowered his taser. Miller's mouth dropped open. The lieutenant colonel marched straight toward the police sergeant. "Who's in charge here?" I am, sir," Sergeant Baker stammered. "We have a situation." "You certainly do," the colonel snapped. "You have a highly decorated Delta Force operator in handcuffs for investigating his mother. You have federal agents on the scene investigating a civil rights violation. And you have about 10 seconds to release my soldier before the military police dismantle this station brick by brick." Sergeant Baker glanced at David, then at Miller. The color drained from his face. "Delta Force, remove the handcuffs," Baker ordered his men. Now the officers rushed to unhandle David. David rubbed his wrists, his expression impassive. He walked past the stunned police officers and stood beside the colonel. "Report, Sergeant Major," the colonel said. "The subject is Officer Stan Miller." David said, pointing a finger at the man now trembling near his patrol car. Unprovoked assault on an elderly civilian. Excessive use of force resulting in serious injury, unlawful detention, and I have reason to believe he fabricated the initial probable cause. Richard Sterling, the attorney, stepped forward. He didn't look at the police officers. He looked at the cameras held by the neighbors. He was already playing to the public's opinion. "Officer Miller!" Sterling boomed, his voice projecting like that of a stage actor. "I represent the Robinson family. I am serving you with a notice of immediate litigation. In addition, these FBI agents are seizing your body camera, your dash cam, and your patrol car as evidence in a federal investigation." Miller looked around wildly. "You can't do this. I'm a police officer." "I have immunity." "Qualified immunity covers mistakes, officer." Sterling grinned, like a shark smelling blood. "It doesn't cover malice. And it certainly doesn't cover what I'm going to find on that body camera. It malfunctioned," Miller stammered, resorting to his old excuse. "It wasn't recording." David stepped forward. He pointed toward the modern house across the street, the one Miller had claimed Hattie was watching. "See that?" David asked. Miller looked up. A sleek black sphere hung under the eaves of the modern porch. "That's a 4K omnidirectional security camera," David said. "And the homeowner is right there on the lawn, streaming the recording to the cloud. We've got it all." The focus, the lack of provocation, the throw, the twist, the screams. David leaned in close so only Miller could hear him. "I told you so," David whispered. "Hard karma." An FBI agent stepped forward holding a pair of handcuffs. "Officer Stanley Miller, you are being taken into custody for questioning regarding federal civil rights violations." The silence that followed was thick. The local police officers watched in shock as one of their own was turned around and handcuffed by the feds. The click, click was the same sound Hattie had heard, but this time it sounded like justice. But the nightmare wasn't over. As Miller was led away, David looked back at his mother. The paramedics had arrived, but Hattie had refused to be taken away until she saw her son free. "Davy," she whispered, her face pale. She fainted. It was all over. David caught her before she hit the floor. Her eyes rolled back. The shock and grief had been too much for her heart. "Doctor!" David shouted, a sound of pure terror that the guns and the police had failed to elicit. "Get here right now!" The twist wasn't just the arrest. The twist was that the battle had been won, but the war for Hattie's life was only just beginning. The fluorescent lights in the ICU waiting room whirred with a sound that felt like a drill pressing into David's skull. The air smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee, the universal smell of bad news. Hattie Mae Robinson was stable but fragile. The fall hadn't just dislocated her shoulder. The shock of the assault had triggered stress cardiomyopathy, broken heart syndrome. Her heart muscle, stressed beyond its limit by adrenaline and fear, had been stunned. She was currently sedated, a symphony of wires and tubes tethering her to this world. David stood by the window, looking out at the St. Jude Medical Center parking lot. He hadn't changed his clothes. He was still wearing his gym shorts and tight t-shirt, now stained with the sweat of a day that felt like a year. He looked like a caged tiger, his reflection in the dark, grim glass. Behind him, Richard Sterling, the powerful lawyer, was on the phone. His voice was low, but lethal. "I don't care what the police union representative says. Bob, if you release that statement, I'll sue you for defamation before the ink's dry. She's a retired nurse and church deacon, not some notorious agitator." Sterling hung up and walked over to David. "They're trying to manipulate you, Major. The department just held a preliminary press conference. They're not admitting guilt. They're claiming that Officer Miller was responding to a mental health crisis and that his mother was disoriented and combative, due to dementia. David didn't turn around, his fist pressed against the windowsill until the glass creaked. She doesn't have dementia. She does her Sunday crossword with a pen. I know, Sterling said gently, but they need a narrative to justify force. They're banking on the fact that she's older and black. They think the public will buy the story of the confused, dangerous old woman. They chose the wrong narrative, David said, turning away. His eyes were dry, but they burned with a cold, terrifying fire. And they chose the wrong family. Just then, David's phone vibrated. It was the Colonel. Turn on the TV, David. Channel 8. David grabbed the remote and switched on the wall-mounted television. The screen showed the news anchor with a grave expression. The headline at the bottom read, Exclusive Oak Creek Arrest Video Assortment, Viewers Advised. The anchor said, The following footage is disturbing. It was the neighbor's 4K security camera footage. The angle was perfect. It showed the peaceful Sunday morning. It showed Hattie watering her hydrangeas. It showed Miller's aggressive approach. The audio was crisp. Why? To water my flowers? Then the crunch of the tackle, the scream, the horrible crack of the shoulder. The waiting room fell silent. A passing nurse stopped, her hand flying to her mouth. Then the video cut to the aftermath. David's arrival, the truck blocking the patrol car, the way he stood there, calm, with his hands raised, while Miller shouted lies. The anchor returned, visibly shaken. This video, provided by a neighbor who wishes to remain anonymous, directly contradicts the statement issued by the Metropolitan Police Department 10 minutes ago. We have contacted Chief Miller for comment, but have not received a response. David stared at the screen. The video had been uploaded to social media simultaneously. The view count climbed in real time. 10,000, 50,000, 100,000. The narrative wasn't just broken, it was obliterated. That's the kinetic shock of the information age, Sterling murmured, a small somber smile playing on his lips. Public opinion just went from wait and see to burn it all down. But David wasn't smiling. He was watching the comments popping up on the live stream. People were angry, but David noticed something else. A comment from a user named Oak Creek Resident 88 caught his eye. Miller did this to Mr. Henderson last month too, accused him of loitering on his own porch. Henderson moved to Florida the following week, sold his house cheap. Another comment. Same thing with Mrs. Higgins in Elm. Harassed her until she sold. Who's buying these houses? David zoomed in. The pattern. It wasn't just racism. It wasn't just a bad cop having a bad day. Sterling, David said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. This wasn't an arrest. It was an eviction. What do you mean? Miller isn't just a thug, David said. His mind went into tactical analysis mode. He was connecting the dots. The loitering accusations, the targeted approach to elderly homeowners in a gentrifying neighborhood, the aggressive effort to criminalize their existence. He's a cleaner. He's wiping the slate clean. David looked at the colonel, who had just entered the waiting room. Colonel, David said, I need intelligence to conduct a financial check on Officer Stan Miller and his brother, the chief, and I need to know who has purchased the last 5 properties on Elm Street. The colonel nodded. I'll have the analysts on it. Do you think this is organized? I don't think my mother was beaten because she was black, David said, his jaw clenching. She was beaten because her house is on a duplex and someone wants to build condos there. The FBI field office's research room was quiet, except for the hum of the computer servers. David wasn't supposed to be there. Civilian access was strictly prohibited, but when you're a level 1 operative and the victim is your mother, the rules become guidelines. Agent Harris, the FBI's lead investigator, tossed a file onto the metal table. It slid toward David. You were right, Harris said, looking tired. It's a sleight of hand. David opened the file. It was a complex network of LLCs, limited liability companies, Harris explained. The last 6 houses in Oak Creek were purchased by Oakview Development LLC. They bought them for 30% below market value. The sellers were all elderly residents with extensive criminal records, records that only began a few weeks before they sold. Harassment campaigns, David said, reading from the file. Miller harasses them with tickets, citations, loitering charges, noise complaints. He makes their lives a living hell until they just want to leave. Exactly, Harris agreed. And here's the kicker. Oakview Development LLC is registered in Delaware, but the operating documents trace it back to a holding company owned by a man named Vance. No, wait, sorry. A man named Victor Thorne. Thorne. David tested the name. Who's that? Local property tycoon, major donor to the Police Benevolent Association, Harris said. And guess who's on the board of his charitable foundation? David turned the page. A photo stared back at him. A man in full police dress uniform shaking hands with a sly-looking developer. Police Chief Gary Miller, Stan Miller's older brother. The chief sends his brother out to terrorize homeowners, David summarized, his voice monotone. The brother creates a criminal record for them, devalues the property, and pressures them to sell. The developer buys it cheap. The boss takes a bribe disguised as a donation or consulting fee. It's a textbook Rico case, Sterling said from the corner of the room. Extortion. Wire fraud. We have enough evidence for an indictment against Stan Miller, Harris said. But the boss, he's isolated. We need irrefutable proof that directly links him to the orders. Without that, he claims his brother acted on his own and washes his hands of it. David stood up. He walked over to the whiteboard where the timeline of events was drawn. He looked at the date of his mother's attack. Stan Miller is a thug, David said, and thugs are cowards. He won't go to jail for his brother. If we pressure him, he'll cave. He's in a holding cell, Harris said. He has a lawyer. He won't talk. He won't talk to you, David corrected, because he thinks his brother can save him. He thinks the blue wall of silence will hold. We need to show him that the wall has already come down. David turned to the colonel. I need a psychological operation. I need Miller to believe his brother has already betrayed him. The colonel smiled. It was a cold, military smile. We can stage some disinformation. 2 hours later, at the county jail. Stan Miller sat in the interrogation room. He looked smaller without his uniform. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the nervous fear of a man who knows he's in deep water. But he still held out hope. Gary will fix it, he told himself. Gary runs this town. The door opened. Agent Harris walked in. He didn't sit down. He just threw a piece of paper on the table. It was a transcript. A fake one, of course. But Miller didn't know that. What's this? Miller asked, his voice rasping. It's a statement from your brother, Chief Gary Miller, that he just gave to the press, Harris said. He calls you a disgrace. He says he had no knowledge of your activities. He's announcing an internal review to root out the cancer in the department. You're the cancer, Stan. Miller read the paper. His hands began to tremble. Officer Miller's actions were the result of his own instability. I always suspected he wasn't fit for service. He's throwing you to the wolves, Stan, Harris said, leaning closer. He's going to let you take the blame for the assault, the civil rights violations, the fraud. You're facing 20 years easy, federal time. Do you know what they do to cops in federal prisons? Miller looked up. His eyes were wet. The betrayal broke him faster than any physical threat ever could have. He told me to do it, Miller whispered. Harris didn't react. He just slammed his fist on the table. I can't hear you. He told me to do it, Miller shouted, pounding the table with his fist. "Gary, he gave me the address list. He said, shake it up. Make him want to leave." "He said Thorne would give us 10% of the operation." Harris grinned. "You want to say that to the tape recorder, Stan? You want a deal?" "I want that son of a bitch in the cell next door," Miller hissed. That night, the quiet suburb of Oak Creek saw another convoy of vehicles. But this time, they weren't headed to Hattie Mae's small bungalow. They were headed to Chief Gary Miller's sprawling, gated mansion. David was in the passenger seat of the FBI SUV he was leading. He wore a heavy body armor over his civilian clothes. He wasn't armed. He didn't legally need to be, but the colonel had insisted he be there to see him. It was part of the healing process. "Breach," crackled the radio. The mansion's front gate was rammed by an armored bearcat. Flashbangs went off in the front yard to disorient the security dogs. "Federal agents! Search warrant!" David watched as the team kicked open the heavy oak doors. He saw the lights come on inside. He saw Chief Miller, wearing silk pajamas, being dragged onto his manicured lawn in handcuffs. The chief looked up. He saw the FBI agents. He saw the media vans parked at the end of the street. And then he saw David. David got out of the SUV. He walked to the edge of the police tape. He looked at the man who had orchestrated the terrorism against his mother. The chief glared at him. "You think you've won? You're nobody." David looked at the chief, then at the moon hanging over the peacefully sleeping houses of his childhood neighborhood. "I'm Hattie Mae's son," David said simply, "and that's enough." As they pushed the chief into the van, David's phone rang. It was the hospital. "Major Robinson." It was the doctor. David's heart stopped. The victory, the raid, justice, it all meant nothing if... "Yes, she's awake," the doctor said. "She's awake. She's asking for you. And she's asking if you remembered to turn off the garden hose." David exhaled a breath he felt he'd been holding for 12 hours. He looked at the colonel. "Come on," David said. "I have to go water the hydrangeas." The recovery was slow, measured not in hours, but in the gradual return of color to Hattie Mae's cheeks. For 3 weeks, David never left her side. He slept in the uncomfortable vinyl chair next to her hospital bed, his enormous frame folded into a shape that defied physics, guarding her rest, just as he had guarded high-value assets in war zones. But this asset was priceless. When the day of her discharge finally arrived, the hospital lobby wasn't empty. As David pushed Hattie through the automatic doors, the bright North Carolina sun made her blink. But it wasn't just the sun. Lined up along the sidewalk, stretching down the block, were people. There was Mrs. Gable was holding a Tupperware container of his famous peach pie. Mr. Henderson was there, having flown in from Florida just for this. Young couples from the new modern houses were holding signs that read, "We're with Hattie." Local VFW veterans stood at attention, saluting as David pushed the wheelchair, and parked right at the curb was the colonel, leaning against the black SUV. He wasn't in uniform today. He wore a suit, but he still looked like he was made of iron. "Your carriage, ma'am," the colonel said, opening the door. Hattie looked out at the crowd, her eyes welling with tears. "Text only, no instructions or comments." She reached up and touched David's hand on his shoulder. "Look at all these people, Davy," she whispered. "I didn't know I had so many friends." "You don't have friends, Mom." David smiled, gently helping her into the car. "You have a battalion." 6 months later, the federal courthouse in Raleigh was packed. The air conditioning struggled against the human heat of the crowd. This was the sentencing hearing for the United States versus Gary Miller, Stanley Miller, and Victor Thorne. The trial had been a spectacle. The evidence David and the FBI had unearthed was overwhelming. The Oakview development scheme was exposed as a multi-million-dollar extortion operation. They found emails where Boss Miller mocked the elderly residents. They found the ledger where Thorne recorded the bribes, but the most damning piece of evidence remained that Sunday morning video. It was played on a loop for the jury. The image of Stan Miller twisting the arm of a weeping grandmother was seared into the jury's consciousness. When the judge asked if the victim wished to make a statement, the courtroom fell silent. David rose to help Hattie, but she gestured for him to step aside. She grasped her cane, a new one, polished ebony with a silver handle, and stood. She walked to the podium slowly, but she wasn't limping. Her shoulder had healed, but the stiffness remained as a constant reminder. She looked at Stan Miller. He was pale, gaunt, stripped of his uniform and his arrogance. He couldn't meet her gaze. "Mr. Miller," Hattie said, her voice clear and strong, amplified by the microphone. "You broke my arm. You hurt my ribs. You humiliated me in front of my neighbors." She paused. "But you did something else, too. You woke a sleeping giant. You thought that because I was old, I was weak. You thought that because I was alone, I had no voice. You forgot that even the oldest tree has deep roots, and if you try to uproot it, you might pull the whole mountain down on you." She looked at the chief, then at Thorne. "You three men treated my neighborhood like a game of Monopoly. You treated people like pieces on a board. But God doesn't like ugliness, and he certainly doesn't like crooks who wear badges." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I don't want vengeance. Vengeance belongs to the Lord. I want justice. I want to know that when I water my hydrangeas next Sunday, no one is going to trespass on my property and treat me like a criminal. I want to know that the license plate means protection, not predation." Hattie sat down. The silence stretched on for a long time. The judge adjusted his glasses. He looked at the defendants with a gaze that promised no mercy. "In my 20 years on the bench," the judge said, "I've rarely seen such a calculated abuse of power. You didn't just break the law, you broke the public trust." The gavel fell with a thud. Stan Miller, 15 years in federal prison for disenfranchisement and assault. Gary Miller, 25 years for RICO violations, conspiracy, and wire fraud. Victor Thorne, 10 years plus a $15 million restitution, fine to be paid to the victims of his real estate scheme. As the marshals led them away in chains, Stan Miller looked back one last time. He saw David standing erect beside his mother. David didn't smile. He didn't rejoice. He simply gave a single, slow nod. Checkmate. It was a Sunday morning, exactly 1 year after the incident. The air was crisp, hinting at autumn. The leaves of the great oak tree were turning a burnt orange. Hattie Mae Robinson stepped off her porch. Her walking stick was in her left hand. Her right hand held the garden hose. The street was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It wasn't the silence of fear or emptiness. It was the peaceful silence of a neighborhood at rest. The 4 for sale signs that had plagued the street were gone. New families waved as they passed. Mr. Henderson had moved back into his house 3 doors down, using the settlement money from the lawsuit to fix his roof. A matte black SUV pulled into the driveway. David jumped out, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. He was carrying a grocery bag. "Good morning, Mom," he called. "Good morning, Davy." She smiled, spritzing a fine mist on her hydrangeas, which were blooming larger and bluer than ever. David drove up the driveway. He stopped at the spot where the concrete was still slightly discolored, where Hattie's blood had fallen. He stared at it for a moment. The memory flashed back. The handcuffs, the scream, the rage. "Are you okay?" Hattie asked, noticing his expression. David looked at her. The rage was gone. The soldier was at peace. "Yes, Mom," he said, coming closer and kissing her cheek. "I'm fine." just admiring the flowers. "They need water," Hattie said, turning the nozzle. "They need strong roots to survive the heat." "They have strong roots," David said, putting his arm around her small shoulders. "The strongest I know." From the end of the street, a police cruiser turned the corner. It was a new officer, a young woman. He slowed down as he drove past the house. He rolled down the window, smiled, and waved respectfully. Hattie waved back. "See?" Hattie said, turning to her son. "Not everyone is bad, Davy. We just had to weed the yard." David laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that echoed in the morning air. "Yeah, Mom," he said. "The yard looks perfect now." Water from the hose caught the sunlight, creating a small, fleeting rainbow over the driveway. It was a bridge of light over the place where darkness had tried and failed. That day in Oak Creek proved that true strength isn't found in a guard dog, a gun, or a bank account. It's found in a son's love for his mother and the courage of a woman who refused to be brought down. Officer Miller thought he was fighting an old woman. He didn't realize he was fighting an entire army. Justice can be blind, but sometimes it has the precision of Delta Force. If you believe karma always catches up with those who abuse their power, and you stand with mothers like Hattie everywhere, like this post, share this story to remind everyone that no one is above the law. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice served.